Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for a New American Security, both to those of you who have joined us here in the room and those of you watching online. I'm Katie Stallard, Senior Editor for China and Global Affairs at the New Statesman magazine, and I am delighted to chair this discussion with our terrific panel to mark the launch of this report, Russia and China in Central Asia, Cooperate, Compete, or Deconflict. I know everybody has to say this, but it genuinely is terrific and important reading, so please do read it. I'm not just saying it. I will try to keep these introductions brief so we have as much time as possible for the conversation. But allow me to introduce Ambassador Donald Liu, Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of South and Central Asia for that Albania as part of a distinguished career in foreign service that has so far spanned 30 years. Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Transatlantic Security Program here at CNAS, where she works on national security challenges facing the US and Europe, with a focus on Russia, authoritarianism, and threats to democracy, prior to which she was a Senior Intelligence Officer. And Lisa Curtis is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Program here at CNAS. She is a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years' experience in the US government, including serving at the National Security Council, CIA, and State Department. So thank you for joining us. We have an hour for this event. I will chair a discussion between the panel first, and then we'll open it up to questions both here in the room, the old-fashioned way, with a microphone that will come to you. And if you're watching online and you'd like to ask a question, you can enter it into the chat box online or on X or Twitter. Invite our panelists, firstly, just to give us a bit of an overview, some opening remarks to set the scene here. Ambassador Liu, let me invite you first to take us through your opening thoughts here.
Thank you so much. And it is wonderful to see so many Central Asia experts in this room. In the United States, we don't have many Central Asia experts. I think you're all here today. I have served 6 years in our embassies in Central Asia. I've served 6 years here in Washington looking at Central Asia. I have seen a lot of competition. I've seen very little cooperation between Russia and China. I had a chance to look through this report over the weekend. Really impressive work by the authors in trying to help us to understand what are the risks ahead as we think about the possibility there could be collaboration between the two. I wanted to start by just telling the story of what that fierce competition looks like on the ground, because it is nasty, it has been backbiting, and I think it's important to understand that if you want to understand the context in which cooperation might grow into the future. So I'll take you back to 2013. In the Kyrgyz Republic, they were going to expand the capacity of their heating and cooling plant called TETS. In big cities in the former Soviet Union to generate electricity for the whole town, but also heat for all the major buildings. And so you had two companies competing for this contract. It was about a $356 million contract, so big money for Central Asia. One of them was Russian. It was called Inter-RAO, a very experienced company that did this sort of work all over the former Soviet Union, very well acquainted with this particular power plant. And then you had a Chinese company that no one had ever heard of, called TBEA, had almost never worked in the energy sector before, and it was that company that gets the contract. So you have to wonder, well, why is that? Well, the answer is, like many things in the BRI, it's because the Chinese said, if we're going to provide the financing, it's got to be our company. And by the way, it's got to be sole source. There's not going to be any competition here. It's just going to be our company without any reference to other potential competitors. Well, if you've been to the Kyrgyz Republic, to the capital, in the last 5 or 6 years, it is now one of the most polluted places in the world. In the wintertime, when that plant is cranking out smoke to heat the buildings of Bishkek, you can taste the air. It is just awful for residents of Bishkek. But that project has just been a disaster from beginning to end. In 2019, 2018, the year after that plant was reopened, in the middle of the winter, a particularly cold snap, the whole thing shut down, leaving 1 million people in the dark and in the cold. There was public outcry, and it meant that many people, including the former prime minister, were jailed for corruption. Kyrgyz people estimate maybe $111 million was stolen from them as a result of this project. If you go ahead a little bit, in 2019, there were then protests, really quite major protests by Kyrgyz nationalists against the Chinese presence. There were, at the time, 25,000 Chinese workers in the Kyrgyz Republic. These nationalists said, you're marrying our women, you're taking our jobs, you're invading our country with your economic presence, go home. The Chinese ambassador lost his job over not being able to control this particular outburst. And then in 2020, when revolution came and brought Sadr Japarov to power, in the days after the revolution, the police just melted away. There is a tradition in the Kyrgyz Republic when they have a revolution, the police don't fire on their own citizens, they just take off their uniforms and go home. In that period of a power vacuum, Chinese businesses were torched, factories set ablaze, copper and gold mines looted, local people threw stones at Chinese workers, sending 40 of them to the hospitals. And what was interesting to me at the time is not a single other foreign investment was touched. And you have to ask yourself, who is fomenting all this anti-Chinese activity? It wasn't us, right? It wasn't the Americans. So if it's not us, at least from where we sat in the embassy, it looked like it was the Russians. So I know a lot of us are worried about China's growing influence in Central Asia. It's definitely worth worrying about. I would say, in fact, that Russians have been pretty effective in the region in keeping the Chinese at bay, keeping their influence in a certain sector. Thanks.
Andrea, I think when we look out at the Russia-China relationship and the trajectory of that relationship, Central Asia is the region that's always brought up as here's where we're going to see some of the limits to this relationship. Here's where we're going to see real resentment from Russia at China encroaching on this region. Can you give us a sense of where Russia's priorities here are and what is to the best of our ability to imagine it, Russia's perspective of how this relationship is changing in the region?
Sure. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thanks everyone for joining us. And maybe I'll just really pick up very quickly where the ambassador left off, because I think it's a really excellent point. It's not to say that there aren't fissures or a perfect synergy of interest between Russia and China in the region. That's certainly not the case, and particularly in the economic sphere, we know that they compete fiercely. But I think my broader point has been that especially in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the convergence of this axis of upheaval with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, but especially the deepening Russia-China relationship, there is now an extreme imperative in both Beijing and Moscow to compartmentalize those differences and prevent them from spilling over and tainting the broader relationship. And again, you're so right that we've been talking about the fact that we should see competition, friction in Central Asia for a very long time. And while it exists, I think in certain cases, there is this broader imperative that they can get along, and compartmentalize those relationships. From the Russia's perspective, I mean, I think if anything, Central Asia has taken on an even greater importance in the wake of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia needs to maintain its dominance in its region. It is now working very hard to establish itself as a major pole in this new international order that it believes it is ushering in. And to be a global power, you first have to be a regional power. And if its influence wanes in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and some of its traditional sphere of what it would consider its sphere of influence, then that's problematic from Russia's perspective. So even though I think there was a lot of expectation at the beginning of the war that Russia's influence would wane, that the Central Asian states would now be increasingly wary of Russian influence, I don't think that's what we've seen. It's evolved, it's changed. So while there may be some wariness, while some of the economic dynamics may be it's changing, I guess is what I want to say. And Russia has figured out in this changing environment how to find other sources of influence. So for example, trade has grown tremendously as many of these countries are now re-exporting goods onto Russia, often in circumvention of sanctions and export controls. Remittances are going to remain a key factor, and although we've seen a blurb with Kyrgyzstan in the wake of the Crocus Hall terror attack, Russia has labor shortages, and it is going to require those migrant workers in order to keep its economy afloat. In the aftermath of the invasion, there was a huge exodus of Russians, many of which are now living in Central Asia. So there's been a disruption, there's been discontinuity as a result of Russia's invasion, but they are finding new avenues and new linkages to increase its influence. And I think in many ways, given its degraded capacity because of the war, it can rely on China in some important ways as well. So,
which tees up Lisa perfectly. Lisa, would you give us a sense of how China's view of the region is changing? And particularly, I think one of the most interesting things I took from the report is this shift towards more involvement in the security sphere as well as the economic sphere.
Great, thank you. And it's great to be here and with this esteemed panel. And I think, Don raised some really interesting points about, some of the things we need to look for in terms of limiting China's expansion in the region. But I think, I'm focused more on the broader arc of what's happening in the region. And I think, from what I'm seeing, China is, definitely expanding, it's increasing its connections to these countries, its economic investments. This region's a major part of its Belt and Road Initiative. So I think, that really is worth looking at very closely. Where, how far has China come in the last, 15 or so years? Trade has reached nearly 90 billion between China and the Central Asian states. It, has far surpassed Russia as the largest trading partner of the region. You look at the energy trade that's going on. Chinese projects in Central Asia now valued at more than 63 billion. China views Central Asia as a long-term supplier of its energy needs. It's already 70% of its total gas imports are coming from Turkmenistan. So I think we certainly, need to watch what China's doing. They are taking on a greater role. And I think in some ways I agree with Andrea that Russia's war in Ukraine is contributing to that shift toward China for many reasons. And one is because of the skepticism in the Central Asian nations about Russian imperialism because of what it has done in Ukraine. And, this could impact Russia's security role moving forward. Of course, right now it has a much more larger security footprint than China, having 7,000 troops in Tajikistan. But China has now opened a military base on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and may even open a second. They're talking about possibly a second. So I think we do see China making inroads, mostly economic, mostly in the energy realm, but also security, kind of slowly with security. And I think the trajectory of terrorism challenges in the region will further impact that. The ISIS-K challenge, that's, ISIS Khorasan coming out of Afghanistan, and the fact that they were responsible for the Crocus attacks in Moscow, as well as the attack in Iran in January. So this could prompt China to want to improve its security ties in the region. But I also want to mention the SCO, because I think this is an important part of how China wants to expand its footprint in this region and move into the security realm. Certainly, Russia and China both view SCO as an important vehicle for advancing their sort of joint goals of, starting to overturn the U.S.-led global order, reduce U.S. global influence. This is one way they can do it. You know, they feel they can kind of start this process in Central Asia. And I think, you know, we need to watch that closely. And, you know, I think there are things that could slow that process in terms of the expansion of SCO. You know, a lot of people say, oh, well, SCO is expanding. That means it's going to get stronger. But at the same time, you've got members like India, and also now the participation of Turkey, Egypt, Kuwait, UAE. They're unlikely to support this idea of the SCO being an anti-West grouping. So, you know, there are a lot of important trends happening in the region, and I think, you know, it bears watching China's role, how that impacts, you know, the Russia-China dynamic. I'm sure there are a lot of underhanded things happening where they're trying to impact each other's influence, and there's some jockeying going on. But they also have a lot of good reasons to try to cooperate. You know, this could be a region where if they do work together and overcome some of their irritants, they could really try to keep the West, keep democracy out of this region.
Ambassador, let me just pick up on 2 points Lisa raised there. This sense of concern about Russian imperialism after the invasion of Ukraine, but also this sense that Russia and China together have something to offer illiberal regimes in the region by pushing democracy out ever further off. How do you think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted on the ground in the region? Has that changed how people assess Russia's intentions? And is Russia still seen as a net positive, a net gain?
I would argue it's hard to look at Central Asia as a monolithic whole, right? You have Kazakhstan that, because of oil and gas wealth, has a sense of self-confidence and independence that the other four Central Asian states aren't going to be able necessarily to match. I'm looking at Alan Mustard here, and Turkmenistan, positive neutrality, yes, providing a lot of natural gas to China, but I think also trying very hard to balance powers in the region, its relations with Turkey and Europe, with Russia and China and the United States. I would say the place where you see competition most at play, not only between Russia and China, but Russia and China with the rest of us, is Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, places that are very dependent on Moscow for remittances, but also dependent on Moscow for security. Both host Russian military bases, but both have nearly half of their external debt owed to the Chinese Exim Bank. So very clearly tied because of loans, and let me be honest, terrible loans that have been taken out over the course of the last 15 years that they're never going to be able to repay. So if you're China, how do you continue to get these countries to follow your lead? You continue to offer them more and more money. I doubt they're going to do that because return on investment, very poor in Central Asia generally, and really poor in the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan. So I think that ability just to offer money forever is lower. And you're all right that I think the war in Ukraine has caused some introspection in Central Asia. And I do think there is some interest in Central Asia at looking at Chinese military equipment. But I would argue that's not, it's countries turning towards China, it's countries turning away from Russia. And they're not just looking at China, they're looking at Iran, they're looking at Europe, they're looking at the United States. They're having to go further afield because military equipment is just not available in the way that it was before the Ukraine war.
Andrea, Lisa spelled out some of the ways in which China is increasing its security footprint. I think there has long been this conventional wisdom that that will really ruffle feathers in Moscow, that this will be seen as taking on a role that traditionally belongs to Russia. But are there areas in which actually Russia is very happy to let China take some of the strain? Are there areas where their interests and their priorities are aligned here?
don't think they're happy to let China move into the security space, but I think that Moscow recognizes that so long as the war continues, they don't have as much choice. So given their preoccupation in the war in Ukraine, the military is squarely focused on what's happening there. As the ambassador said, fewer arms sales, so Central Asian countries are having to turn to China and Turkey. So I don't think it's something that Moscow relishes, but I think the point that we make in the paper is that it's unlikely to seriously bristle feathers so long as the war in Ukraine is continuing and so long as what China is doing is in the interest of Russia as well. And as Lisa said, they have really powerful incentives for cooperation in the region, and one of the key drivers is their common threat perception and their desire to maintain stability in the region. That's really critical, both for Beijing and Moscow. And given Moscow's focus on what's happening in the war and their inability perhaps to play that role, then I think that they would have to kind of concede and find utility in Russia's role in the region. One of the things we talk about is, of course, right before the war, February 2022, Russia with CSTO goes in to try to prop up Tokayev in Kazakhstan. But I think if something similar happened now while the war is continuing, that Russia would have very limited bandwidth and ability, and so that could be a role that perhaps China could play. The other thing that Lisa mentioned is the terrorism aspect, and I think that's another thing that I'm watching very carefully is Russia able to maintain its kind of security ties across the region in the way that it was before, given that the FSB and other internal security actors are squarely focused on Ukraine, but also maintaining domestic security? And with the Crocus attack in Moscow, I think there are a lot of questions that the Central Asian states might have, that China might have about Russia's ability to play that role in the region. And so if you had greater spillover or other forms of instability, we have to remember these are incredibly brittle regimes and things can happen very quickly. And so our argument is that given Moscow's preoccupation, they wouldn't be able to deal with it. And so China could find itself playing a larger role. The key question will be what happens after the war. And I think then, especially if Russia walks away from Ukraine believing that it was not defeated, will it try to reestablish its presence in the region? And in that sense, then I could imagine Russia wanting to return to this more traditional division of labor and having perhaps sharper elbows once again in the security field, in the security domain in particular.
Lisa, can you talk a little bit about how we see some of the infrastructure, some of the interconnections across the region changing? It was very striking reading the report, looking at the maps of, for instance, the proposed extension of the gas pipeline into China, the proposed development of this middle corridor for trade routes. It strikes me that China seems very much to want to not be too dependent on Russia and to want to make sure that it has diversified sources of energy across the region. How significant do you see those calculations?
Yeah, I think in our paper, if we were going to find one area where competition could definitely derail sort of the overall cooperation or, project that they may be trying to carry out in Central Asia, it is over this issue of the tension between the fact that China would benefit by developing that middle corridor and being able to export through Central Asia, across the Caspian and into Europe and other parts of the world, whereas Russia, of course, wants everything to go through Russia, the sort of north-south route. So I think this could definitely be a source of tension, but things are moving pretty slowly. You've got the rail line going through Kazakhstan, which is one of the biggest BRI projects. A lot of trade happening through there from China through Kazakhstan and going into Europe. When it comes to energy, it's a bit more complicated. Kazakhstan is certainly trying to reduce its reliance on having to go through Russia through the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. However, still, nearly 80% of its oil is going through that pipeline. And it was only in March 2023 that Kazakhstan started shipping oil from its Caspian seaport in Aktau to the Baku or through the Baku-Tbilisi-Kayhan, the TBC pipeline. And that's only about 5% of its oil that's going through that pipeline. Don can correct me if I've got the numbers wrong. Okay. So it's going to take a long time to get that infrastructure going and to get that energy moving, through the middle corridor, so to speak, as opposed to the traditional pipelines that are going through Russia. So that's a long-term project. But I do think that the U.S. has a role to play here. The U.S. has not focused a tremendous amount of attention on Central Asia, but we should be doing more. We should be engaging with these countries. They welcome U.S. support for their territorial integrity and independence. They welcome U.S. investment. And so this is an opportunity, I would say, for the U.S., and in particular when it comes to this issue of energy corridors. Europe is doing more. The EU has a Central Asia strategy. They've been, really trying to coax more European investment in the region. So I think this is an opportunity that hopefully the U.S. will continue to do now that incoming Trump administration can put even more resources into this effort.
Let me throw this out to all three of you and see who wants to take it up, and I suspect it will not be Ambassador Liu, but I can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is the imminent return of power to Donald Trump, and you mentioned opportunities for the U.S. in the region, but how do you anticipate that a new Trump administration will approach the region?
Well, all I can say is when I was senior director at the National Security Council for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021, we did have a Central Asia strategy. We did spend time working through the interagency to develop a Central Asia strategy that was released to the public. I'm trying to remember the year. I think it was 2019. No, 2019. Yeah, January 2019, I believe. So, there was interest in focusing more resources. Of course, President Trump welcomed to the White House both the, President Mirziyoyev from Uzbekistan as well as the former president of Kazakhstan. And so, there was engagement in the region. And, with the counterterrorism challenges, I think there's even more motivation to work closely with the Central Asians, particularly countries like Tajikistan, as well as Uzbekistan, because, what we are seeing, ISIS-K is still operating out of Afghanistan. They're directing attacks externally. This is a problem. The Taliban's still allied with al-Qaeda, so there's always the chance that al-Qaeda comes back up as a major threat to the United States. And so, we have to work with the Central Asians to make sure they have the resources and the capabilities to protect their own borders and, protect them from extremism spilling over from Afghanistan into the region. So I think, there are a lot of reasons for a Trump administration to engage robustly in Central Asia. And certainly the geostrategic competition with China will continue to be a major concern of the United States. And, this is a region where China is making more and more inroads. And, the U.S. doesn't want to see Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan over-indebted to China, like Don was explaining. So it's in the U.S. interest to help these countries be able to manage their economic situation and provide alternative investment to that China's offering.
I think the only thing I would add to what Lisa said, I very much agree with everything she said, is also then the de-emphasis of democracy and human rights obviously makes that relationship a lot easier from the United States perspective. And I do think that kind of from the Central Asians' perspective, with Trump as more of kind of the strongman image, I think there's more comfort in those direct interactions. And so there are, I think, a lot of factors that would facilitate everything Lisa laid out, but then that kind of de-emphasis of democracy and the greater comfort perhaps in engaging a President Trump does facilitate more U.S. engagement in the region. Ambassador Lee, you want to add anything?
Well, I can't speak for a future administration here, but we are hearing from our Central Asian partners a desire for continuity of policy. As Lisa mentioned, two of the heads of state from the region visited the Oval Office during President Trump's time. We've had a C5+1 summit with President Biden. I do think they notice that we are paying attention. I do think they are aware that we have a strategy in place under both administrations to move forward, and they're looking forward to continued engagement from Washington.
Let me throw out another jump ball topic here, which is how much you think the current Russia-China relationship alignment, whichever word you prefer to use, is dependent on the Putin-Xi interpersonal dynamic, and how much are these longer-term structural factors that will affect U.S. policy in the region?
I can start. I mean, I think certainly the relationship is very top-down. Putin and Xi have a very close personal relationship. I think it's still true that they're the dyad, the pair of leaders who have met more times than any other pair of leaders. So that really is a very important driving factor. But I think the point that we regularly make is that, you know, the more interaction that Russia-China have in key regions, on key issues, those are the relationships and the interactions that form the basis of a deep and enduring relationship. And you are seeing at various levels of government that cooperation trickling down, different working groups, different delegations meeting. And so with that repeated interaction, they're able to overcome the historical distrust and other things that people have long talked about as being a constraint on the relationship. I think that the other thing that I'll highlight that we flag in the report too is that, you know, the one thing that people say quite a lot about Russia, China, Putin, and Xi is that, yes, we understand what they oppose, but we don't believe that they have a positive vision for the future. And I think it's interesting just that we continue to check that assumption, and Central Asia is an interesting case because I do think that you can start to see the very broad contours, or at least some overlap in what they could agree on for a future international system. I mean, obviously, both leaders believe in a multipolar world. Both leaders talk very much about this concept of indivisible security. That was the rationale, that one country can't take an action that makes another country feel unsafe. That's the language that Putin used to justify his invasion of Ukraine, and now that language has found its way into the Global Security Initiative, the GSI. You see like that both of them believe in state-determined political rights, that there's no universal definition of human rights. And I think you hear Russia talk a lot now about the world majority, and China talks about the community with a shared future for mankind. So again, these are little glimmers, and I don't want to overstate the case, but I do think that we have to constantly check ourselves because the cooperation is deepening at a rate that I think that, you know, is surprising to me. And watching exchange of technology and other things, Russia has done for China things that I would have found hard to imagine just a couple years ago. And if you had asked me if they have a shared vision of a future world order, you know, a year or two ago, I would have been hard-pressed to begin to articulate what the contours. The last point I'll make is then in looking in some of the work that we've done with our team in shifts from single-order worlds to multipolar worlds, oftentimes the emerging alternative order is by definition defined in the earliest stages as what they oppose, what they want to overturn, and it's only over time that a new world order emerges. And so I just think we have to be constantly aware, you know, of where we are and that they can be moving in this direction. And I would look at Central Asia as an early indicator of what they are trying to build.
We'll open it up to questions after this. Lisa, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think I agree with everything that Andrea said, and would just add, you know, we don't know if this is primarily driven by the leadership, but for the foreseeable future, I think we see these two leaders in place. So I think we should assume that, this is more of a long-term trend. I don't think you can write off some of the cooperation that we've seen between Russia and China over the last couple of years as a one-off or, that won't last. I think we need to take it seriously, and so we need to think about U.S. strategy as well. And I think that's why I think it's helpful that Don pointed out some of the real friction that we see between Russia and China and Central Asia, and we're likely to see it in other areas as well. The 10,000 or so troops, North Korean troops that are now in Russia, probably getting ready to fight in Kursk. This is something that I think, most people think, well, the Chinese probably are not thrilled about this. They haven't been uncomfortable enough to take any action or do anything about it or even make a statement criticizing this. But at the same time, are there opportunities? Are there, pieces of daylight between these two countries that, we shouldn't ignore and, we should bring to light or, use in any way possible? Because certainly, the U.S. needs a strategy to deal with what I see as more of a long-term trend that could be very dangerous.
Ambassador Lee, I'll give you the last word on this. What do you make of this argument that we could see this region and cooperation between Russia and China as a test case for this idea of an alternative global order?
So for most of my professional life, Russia has, of the two countries, Russia has been the big brother, China's been the little brother, right? But that's clearly not the case in the world today. China has so much influence, so many more resources. But I spent time in Central Asia as recent as last year. As I go around Central Asia, Russia's still the big brother. Russia has not let go of its interests, its influence. Yes, it's suffering a bit as a result of the Ukraine war, but honestly, it's still the predominant player. I think it will be very reluctant to give up that position. And even though I agree with the report and many of the comments that it makes sense for them to cooperate, I don't see it, in fact. I see Russia jealously guarding its great power status from years ago. And Central Asia is one of those last places where they're holding out that status.
Let me open this up to questions both here in the room, and let me remind you how you can do this if you're watching online. You can put your question in the chat box, or if you're on Twitter/X with the hashtag CNAS 2024. I will call on the lady in front here. If you introduce yourself and wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi. Does this work? Yeah. My name is Jai Zhao. I'm based at SIPRI, but I'm here at the Kennan Institute for a short while. I very much appreciated the ambassador's comments about sort of the points of friction that sometimes are not as much drawn out in analysis. And in terms of the different domains in which that can be seen, of course, the general is to talk about economic and security and high-level politics, but also the informational domains, I think, is important. And I think what you were saying about who fomented some of that anti-Chinese activity in Central Asia is very interesting. I did fieldwork in China earlier this year, and one of the more interesting findings to come out of discussions with Chinese experts on Russia was the informational sphere, where not only in third regions are they necessarily cooperating or aligning some of their messaging, but also China as a sort of as grounds for Russian mis and disinformation that has influenced not only the Chinese populace but possibly policymakers as well. So I'm curious about. For more, sort of more anecdotes, I think that really draw out these kinds of frictions, but also in the informational domain, I think specifically how you've seen that play out in Central Asia. I have a related question, and not too related question actually, but in terms of the energy sector, there's been discussion of sort of the traditional spheres of energy cooperation of fossil fuels primarily. But obviously there has been developments in the past 6-7 years, and one of those is China as a massive investor in renewables, which is also playing out in Central Asia, and that then goes to a broader point about a positive vision for for the future, where I think Russia actually has a lot less to offer in terms of economic governance, in terms of reforms, obviously not at the level of regimes, but in terms of sort of mid-level governance and training and economic kinds of models where I think at least Uzbekistan is looking closer to the Chinese model than anything in Russia. So along these three very broad, vague, hard questions, I just, if there could be any input. Thanks.
Maybe I'd start with information. The Russians are really good at disinformation in Central Asia, right? We outspend them probably 10 to 1. We are doing these amazing outreach programs with young people, offering scholarships, are educating journalists about our version of what good journalism looks like. They're just going in and buying the newspapers and the websites and troll farms, and they're much more directly influencing or attempting to influence eyeballs and listeners, and they've historically had a lot of success. I've seen the Chinese attempt to do some of the same. They're terrible at it. They're terrible at it for linguistic reasons. They're terrible at it because they haven't had much experience. I do see parallel play when they both want to criticize the West and democracy. They're definitely doing that, but I don't see a lot of evidence that they're working together. They just have the same theme that they've latched onto. But the Russians are quite experienced, and they, if they wanted to, could teach the Chinese a thing or two about disinformation.
Andrea, you look like you want to come in.
Well, but I guess it's because it's less Central Asia focused. But I guess I would say, I mean, the Chinese do seem to be taking some notes from what Russia is doing. And the example of our own domestic system here is a prime example. So, it used to be the case that we would say that China doesn't really do disinformation, that they more press narratives about China's peaceful rise. But I think that's changing, and kind of evidence from our own domestic political environment. I think China is learning lessons, and Russia has been able to really pave the path for other countries to get into the game. And again, taking some examples from other spheres, thinking about whether or not they might increasingly coordinate on hybrid kind of tactics that are hard to attribute. The thing that always jumps to mind is the Baltic connector with the new polar bear that went through, closely guided by a Russian ship. Again, from the outside, really hard to know and understand exactly what happens. But my sense is even if they're not coordinated in every way, the first point that the ambassador said is, yes, that because they are pushing the same narratives, it's amplifying the dose of the messages that they put. And I think it makes their messages more legitimate with many audiences. So the fact that they're rowing in the same direction is amplifying the impact of the messages when they're not coordinated. But I am increasingly watching to see if there will be more coordination in this hybrid domain, with Russia out paving the path and leading the way, particularly on the harder to attribute. Again, that's not specific yet to Central Asia, but you do see it in other spheres, and it's something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I would just add, I don't think it's an either or proposition. I mean, you could have cases where Russian disinformation is trying to discredit what China's trying to do in Central Asia, but at the same time, you could have them cooperating when they have mutual interests, which again is, keeping the West out of Central Asia, keeping democracy out, and trying to reduce U.S. influence in the region, and kind of using Central Asia as an example of how their brand, or what they're trying to sell is more successful, trying to really play it up in that region. So I don't think it's either or. I think they could be trying to undermine each other in some cases and then working together on their mutual objectives.
Let's take another question. Gentleman near the back.
I'm Michael David Fox. I'm the Director of Eurasian Russian East European Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Don, that was quite an anecdote about Bishkek that you began with, and my question is related, because when you look at the security services of Central Asia, their training, their education, their professional networks all come out of Russia and date back to KGB and nomenclatura times. How much of this do you think is a factor, sort of Russian trump card, if you will. And my second point has to do with the educational networks, because you see a ton of young people studying both in Russia and in China. I know mostly Kazakhstan, but both countries there, despite all tensions. And regarding what the U.S. is doing, why is there not more emphasis, with or without, a Trump administration, about bringing Central Asian young people to study for longer periods in the U.S.? Thank you.
Well, just would completely agree that the best investment we make with our limited U.S. resources is on education. When you meet these young people, not just from Central Asia, but from around the world, who spend a year or more in our country, they come away with a different, more sophisticated view of who we are, the good, the bad, but they also come away with an appreciation for what their country could be. And you cannot recreate that with any other activities on the ground in host countries. Specific to your question about security services in Central Asia, yeah, I'm shocked. Whenever I went over to the GKNB in any of the countries there, you have Russians walking around with the badges of the local security services. They are almost indistinguishable from one another, and they are very deep in influencing these KGB successor organizations. Now, in the 5 Central Asian states, those KGB successor organizations are in various countries more and less dominant. So I think it makes a huge difference in weaker states. In stronger, bigger, more prosperous states of Central Asia, I think that role is somewhat limited.
Lisa or Andrea, you would like to? Let me bring in a question from online. This comes from Kate, who asks, can you say more about what Central Asian states want in terms of their relationships with China and Russia? Is there any chance they want to move more towards the West, especially if there's more support from the US and the EU?
Yeah, I would just repeat what I had said earlier, that I think that all of this means there is an opportunity for the United States. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has made at least Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian republics more wary and wanting to diversify their relationships with other countries. Of course, China's there. They're there geographically. They're investing. They're coming in. They're doing projects. But were they given other alternatives from the U.S. or Europe? Certainly, they would take those. But they have to be on offer. So that's why I say this is an opportunity, and that the U.S. should be increasing its trade, its investment, its counterterrorism cooperation, its diplomatic cooperation. I think, at heart, the Central Asian states would certainly object to any kind of concept of a Russia-China condominium over the region, but they also need those alternative sources of investment and political support that can only come from the West. So yeah, I think that this really should become more of a focus for U.S. policy moving forward. How can we help the Central Asians develop alternative energy outlets, trade corridors, and also the way the U.S. interacts with Central Asia, I think, is deeply appreciated. Don mentioned the C5+1. That was actually started during the Obama administration. I think it was Nisha Biswal who started this whole idea of the U.S. engaging with all 5 Central Asian nations at the same time. It was continued through the Trump administration. It's been continued through the Biden administration. And if the Central Asian nations can reduce their frictions with each other, if they can have greater trade, intra-regional trade within the region, they're going to be stronger, and they're going to be able to resist, authoritarian powers trying to gain more control. So I think the way the U.S. engages with Central Asia is effective and it's appreciated, but there just needs to be more of it.
And let me invite more questions. I'm going to start grouping questions as we're running slightly short on time. So let's have the lady midway back here and the gentleman in the vest. We'll ask your questions together, please.
Victoria Clement from Foreign Service Institute, South and Central Asia Studies. We've talked a lot about policy, policymakers, leadership. I'm wondering what we can glean about the people on the ground, what the populace wants. And Ambassador Liu, you started with an instructive anecdote, and I'm wondering what more you could tell us about signs of xenophobia among the populations, understanding that each country is going to be different for a variety of reasons, or the increasing desire to step back from Russian culture, Russian language, and Russia's influence among the population. Thank you.
We'll group the next question with this gentleman, and then we'll come to you next after that.
Clark Adams. Up until February, I was the Central Asia Director in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for 16 years. And I want to ask basically particularly the authors of the report on the security side, viewing it from the China angle. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative is always seen, or most people talk about it, in the context of economics. What about as a strategic depth issue, giving China access to markets in Western Europe, ports, strategic materials, and hydrocarbons without having to deal with the contested sea lines of communication? Is that something that you factored into your report? And if not, you know, maybe a little bit more crosswalk with the China community might be useful.
Clark, it's so great to have you back. We miss you every day. What do Central Asian people want? I think it's hard for us as Americans to guess what they really want. I would say most of the friends that I have known over time, they want what Americans want. They want stability so that their family can prosper, so their kids can go to school, so they can tomorrow have a slightly better life than they had yesterday. That's pretty hard in most of Central Asia. Kazakhstan is doing well economically. The others are struggling a bit. I would say the way that we can help Central Asia the most is, as Lisa said, to be present and to compete. We all talk about BRI and how much money the Chinese are putting in. Actually, they're not. The West is investing so much more in Central Asia than the Chinese, both over time and today. Who's the #1 investor in Kazakhstan, the biggest economy? It's not China, it's not Russia, it's not the United States. It's the Netherlands. Little Netherlands puts in 5 times more investment than China does. And we, the United States, we're #2. We put in twice as much investment in Kazakhstan as China. China is #4 after Switzerland, and #5 is Russia. And where we compete, the Chinese are forced to do better projects. I was in the Kyrgyz Republic where the Chinese were literally building roads to nowhere. Roads that terminated in unpopulated areas because they were trying to maximize the debt that they were going to put on the Kyrgyz people. It wasn't about quality of projects. It wasn't about responsiveness. It was about corruption and getting the maximum money that that country would be owed. Versus Kazakhstan, the Chinese have to compete against us, against Europeans, against the Japanese, and it's a much more normal environment where the Chinese are having to have high labor standards and do things that normal investors would do. And so I go back to the earlier question, what's rational for Central Asians? What's rational is for them to take the best from all of us, but in order for that to happen, we, the West, need to actually show up.
Either of you care to take the point about strategic depth?
Yeah. Hi, Clark. Great to see you. Look, you articulated it better than anyone. Absolutely. I think Belt and Road Initiative is a strategic project. It's not purely economic. It's about gaining access to strategic ports, energy grids. So by definition, it's a strategic project. And I do think that China is, has ambitions to be able to extend more and more access and greater control through Central Asia to be able to access European markets. They're already doing so through, the rail line through Kazakhstan, as we talked about. So I think, the project has started. It's almost certainly going to continue. And, I think, that's why the United States has to focus more on this region and not think of it, as, so far away and, landlocked and doesn't impact, because I think it's increasingly important, and China, is seeing that, and China's acting on that, and it's just something that the U.S. needs to digest in, sort of this global order that we're facing, and the challenges that we're facing, and the increased China-Russia cooperation that we're seeing. The place where we're seeing it play out is Central Asia. And, the U.S. has to be in the game, so to speak. I don't want to say another great game, but in a way, I think that's what we're facing. So thank you.
Let me try to squeeze two final questions under the wire. A gentleman in the front, and then gentleman at the back.
You mentioned that Mark Kennedy from the Wilson Center.
If you just take the microphone. Thank you.
Mark Kennedy from the Wilson Center. You've mentioned several times that they would welcome more investment and that America showing up is important. We, through our Development Finance Corporation or our Ex-Im Bank, need a private partner to do that. If you were to, choose what types of investments and what types of companies would we most incrementally need to have to really have a bigger influence in Central Asia?
And then we'll just group the gentleman at the back as well.
Hi, Richard White's Hudson Institute. Just based on your earlier discussion, did you see any examples of the Central Asian states themselves or actors that are able to leverage the difference in Russia and China independent of an external third party like us? I mean, and what struck you as being particularly insightful?
U.S. Development Finance Corporation, we have been so frustrated over the last 4 years about their lack of investment in Central Asia, right? This was an institution that Congress set up to compete with BRI. Where is that battle happening? It's happening in Central Asia, and they were absent. But we've had, for the past year plus, a secret weapon. Nisha Biswal, who used to be in my job, who used to be the assistant administrator for Asia in USAID, is now the deputy CEO, the number 2 at DFC, and has been really focused on trying to make sure that we're present there. I think we're actually very close. And what's DFC doing in the broader region very effectively is looking at clean energy. And the sun shines across Central Asia for more than 330 days of the year. They have thermal, they have hydro, they have a lot of potential clean energy resources. It's an obvious place for us to be working.
That's a great question, Richard. And actually, I mean, nothing is immediately coming to mind. And I guess I hadn't thought of it in the frame of the Central Asian states able to play Russia and China off each other. I mean, the lens that we had thought about it through was, are there ways that the U.S. could leverage friction between Russia and China? And as much as we've thought about that, it increasingly seems like even though there are all of these natural fissures and points of divergence between them, U.S. leverage and ability to tug at those seams is minimal. And so that's where I come down. But I am going to think about that question, I mean, because I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah. I think Kazakhstan subtly has been able to do this when Russia cut back on the oil exports through the CPC pipeline in 2022 as a result of some remarks that Tokayev had said about Donetsk and Luhansk not being quasi-territories, so in a sense not really supporting Russian claims to those territories in Ukraine. So the Russians retaliated by cutting back the oil through the CPC pipeline. So, Kazakhstan is starting to, like I said, diversify its energy exports. It's very slow going. But also, I think, China has stepped in to sort of demonstrate that, it respects Kazakhstan's territorial sovereignty. So I think they've been playing a very subtle game of trying to play China and Russia off each other to sort of, protect their own sovereignty and their own interests. And, that's not a very specific example, but I think it's a subtle way they've done that. In terms of you're asking what kind of U.S. companies, would be welcome. I mean, we know the energy companies are already operating there. I know some agriculture companies have had some success, particularly in Kazakhstan. You mentioned some of the renewable energy resources. I'm thinking maybe mining, critical minerals. Yeah. So I'm not an expert on the economic opportunities there, but I'm sure if somebody was to explore this more closely, there are plenty. And I would also mention during the Trump administration, the former Commerce Secretary during that time took some very important visits to Central Asia, particularly Uzbekistan, I think led a trade delegation. So, those are the kinds of things that we need to see. Leadership that is leading the way and, leading trade delegations and encouraging this kind of investment from U.S. companies.
Alas, we are out of time. So let me thank you all for joining us, both here in the room and online. Thank you for the terrific questions. Please do read this terrific report. And most importantly, please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.